And good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another live Xanadu Gallery Art Business Academy online critique group session. Today is Wednesday, April 15th, 2020. It is a pleasure to be here with you. As always, as you can see, I'm back in Scottsdale after having been in Pine Top last week. Still strange times going on, but it's been a lot of fun to get to interact with so many of you. In ways that we might not otherwise get to if we were all in our normal routines and schedules. And this online critique group has certainly been a great way to do that. As I promised last week, this week we are going to go in a little bit different direction than we have in our previous sessions, in that our artwork for today takes on a third dimension. We're going to be looking at the sculpture of artist Chaz Martin, and I've got Chaz here on the line. Good morning, Chaz. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing great.
And we were talking before the session, and you are in Portland, Oregon, where you have your studio. Let's begin just getting a little bit of background of how you became interested in art, and a little bit of the path of your life that led you to where you are today.
Um, I started early, but thought I was going to be a psychology major, and then after a term of that, decided no, I really wanted to be an art major. So after 4 years of visual communication, I wound up in advertising in Boston and then San Francisco. In '81, I moved to Oregon and started my own design firm, I think by accident. I always painted and enjoyed doing personal art throughout my commercial art career. In about 2006, I think, I got away from advertising in the corporate world and became a full-time artist. And I was committed to learning how to paint in watercolor. I limited myself to watercolor for about 6 years, and I think I averaged about one a day through that period. It was a trip to Sedona about 4 or 5 years ago. I had always been fascinated with petroglyphs, and as I started, I thought this would make an interesting sculptural form or a sculptural style. That was the beginning of, and as soon as I did one, my studio mate at the time said, you know, this is the most distinctive work you've ever done. Why don't you stick with it for a while? And that was about 4 years ago. I find this I describe as a deep well. I don't think I'm going to run out of ideas anytime soon. I'm enjoying exploring archetypal characters, and I see them as all of them as actors in a film that hasn't been written yet. That's how I got to where I am.
Yeah, excellent. And talk a little bit then about if and it would be fun to see these, but if you were to go back and look at some of the watercolor work and other work that you had done prior to getting to the sculpture, could you see threads or veins or ideas that were developing in your two-dimensional work that also came into play in the sculpture, or was the sculpture something that was just totally unique and in a completely different direction?
Can I say both?
Yeah.
I was trying to bring figure into landscape, and it was very creepy. It wasn't working. Then I started exploring ravens and other bird forms, which seemed to make more sense. And I think it was the bird forms that drew me into the petroglyphs. And I mean, I still paint. Mostly I paint sculptures, but I also sculpt paintings. So I mean, I'm kind of in that in between. I see myself predominantly now as a sculptor. Yes, I do see threads that have always been there. These archetypal characters now, those seem to be dominating the scene.
And so with your kind of the work that you're doing, well, let's jump in and take a look at the pieces that you're doing and kind of talk a little bit about some of the different aspects of that work. And just as a reminder, what we're going to discuss as we're looking at the work and reviewing it is we're going to be looking at consistency, quality, style, marketability, pricing, and then offering some words of encouragement. And we'll be doing that both in terms of the live conversation that we're having and also some of the input that you all have given ahead of time. Looking at these pieces, Chaz, tell us a little bit. We have about 7 different pieces that we'll look through. Tell us a little bit about the technical process that goes into creating these pieces. What is, you list the medium as mixed medium. So what does that involve and how are you creating these works?
Underneath most of these is as much as 30 or 40 feet of steel wire. So the armatures are pretty sophisticated, fairly complicated, but I see them as a line drawing in space, and I can manipulate the texture and the finer elements of the pose many times on a turntable before I am committed. From wire, it basically goes to several layers of paper mache. I use a polymer as a binder. And then over that, I am adding other thickeners to the polymer so that the final layers are more like clay. The finished pieces are extremely rigid, and then I have a good solid foundation on which to paint. I'm using acrylic paint. I have a short attention span, so I want something that dries fast.
And in terms of the scale of the work, what we're seeing here is primarily pedestal size. Would that be fairly typical of the work that you're doing?
Yes, I think my smallest pieces recently are in the 14-inch range. Most of them are 24 to 32, somewhere in that range.
Okay, excellent. And so then I'll just got a couple of quick images that kind of, I mean, we're already getting a pretty good sense of presentation from all the photos, but these give us some images kind of showing the dimensionality and showing them on display. And so I think our conversation, well, again, rather than me talking, let me bring a few of you in and get some of your just kind of quick reaction to the question of consistency. Do you see a consistency that ties this work together? And I'll go first to the video panel. And if any of you want to jump in and comment on that consistency, just throw a hand up and I'll unmute you. I'd love to get your feedback on how strongly you feel the work is tied together. And then also any of those of you who are attendees and would like to comment, you can throw a hand up and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the consistency of the work. Anyone willing to jump in and make a comment or two? Karen, I think I've got you. Good morning, Karen. Oh, let me see. Well, Karen, I might
mute myself.
There we go. Gotcha.
Okay, well, I can certainly see a wonderful consistency. There's no doubt in my mind the same person made these series of sculptures. They are very playful, and yet they have an interesting message to them. I really like them.
Yeah, I also definitely agree with this idea that there is a strong consistency in the work. And not only are they all cohesive and consistent, but there's a uniqueness to them that tells me that this work was created all by the same mind with the same vision. And even though there's some variety in terms of the compositions and even some of the emotions behind the work, there's just no question that as you look at these pieces, that there's a story. That there is, and you can put them together and have them create a cohesive narrative around the work. Let me see. I've got Julia too. Julia, let's see if I can get you in and just any of your comments on consistency. Do I have you, Julia?
I'm here.
Good morning.
Oh, okay. Well, that's my picture anyway.
Yes, there we go.
Google picture. There we go. I do see a lot of consistency in the work, and I am taken by the dynamic element of the work. And I think that is consistent as well. Everything is moving. and I think that's a challenging thing to achieve. And I congratulate our artist for achieving that, in my opinion. The other thing I wanted to say was I've spent a lot of time in Mexico, and some of the artists down there whom I have liked very much, there's an element of magic realism to this. I'm a fan of that, and in both literature and art. And I see an influence there, whether it's intentional or not, or whether you even know about what I might be talking about. But I do see that.
Yeah,
too.
Chaz, any comments on that? I also see, as certainly as you look at the artwork and creations of many different indigenous peoples, I'm thinking of, Australian and some of the African artwork that I've seen. Although they're very different in terms of style, there's still some thematic elements that right here that come through here. So Chaz, how, you mentioned they're coming from petroglyphs, but how much of that kind of I guess, do you read about or study native peoples, or is it just coming more from a purely visual standpoint?
My mind is a sponge. I absorb visuals. I read constantly. If I'm reading, I'm also sketching at the same time. I have explored primal art from many different cultures. And most recently, I've been listening to lectures on Jung while in the studio. Jung's theories of archetypes have always fascinated me. Let's shift gears real quick for a second. Motion and gesture are something that if you see a friend a block away, you recognize them not by their facial features at that distance, but by their body language, their stance, their gesture, their movement. I think much like an actor on a stage, a gesture communicates far more than a facial expression. So a lot of my inspiration really comes from how the figure holds itself, regardless of whether it's more realistic or more abstract. What is the gesture of the figure communicating? A lot of people at first glance see these as very whimsical. Yes, there is an element of whimsy in them, but they each have a narrative or a story or a singular concept underneath them. Sometimes it's a little bit darker than the first impression.
Yeah, and I think as I've reviewed and looked through your imagery, you kind of do see that. You get a first impression, and then on further exploration, you kind of see that there are more dimensions potentially to the narrative and the story behind these pieces. And we'll get to some questions about that as we get into some of the comments that were submitted prior to the broadcast. What about in terms of showing this work and kind of reaction from your audience? How has the work been received by the kind of the art interested public and the art buying public?
It's taken me a while to find an audience. I mean, everyone reacts to it, but not everyone wants to live with it. I had one older woman visit my studio about a year and a half ago, and she wandered around, and she was obviously very nervous about this. And at some point, she said, "I don't think I'd want these in my house," and I couldn't resist. I said, "I don't think they'd want to be there."
Oh,
I mean, I usually contain myself a little bit, but I couldn't resist that one. Most of my sales in the past 6 months have been local people. Most of them have bought more than one piece. So it's
and how are they discovering your work?
I showed up at Art on the Pearl, which is Portland's biggest art event annually for the last couple of years. That gets, I don't know, 20,000 visitors over the Labor Day weekend. I have participated in open studios for several years here in Portland. I have shown at several local galleries in juried shows. I've had a couple of my own shows here and in Vancouver, Washington, right across the river. When I almost met you in Scottsdale last spring, I've been looking for other audiences. And I have a feeling, someone mentioned New Mexico. I've always had a feeling that, one, I lived in the Southwest in a former life, and two, I think something tells me that would be a better market for my work.
Yeah, it's certainly there are certain regions that are drawn to artistic sensibilities, and so how have you how did you come to price these works? How did you decide on the values?
Uh, I took your advice from one of your webcasts years ago and priced them. Once I established a price for one, that was my benchmark, and I priced them by size. It's occurred to me recently that I'm probably underpricing. I've noticed in the last 4 or 5 sales, the price was not even a consideration. They either liked it or they didn't.
Yeah.
That tells me I could probably go higher.
Well, and of course, as one starts to, as the volume of sales increases and demand picks up, it becomes a function of supply and demand, and you'd certainly have the range to do that. From what I'm seeing with the pricing, I'd love to go ahead and open it up to any of you who are attending or in the panel. Just any other comments that you'd like to make about the work or your impression or feedback, and then we'll get into some of the comments and discussion that were submitted prior. Looks like I've got a hand up from Marianne. Let me see. It's been up for a few minutes, so I don't know if you still have a comment, but Marianne, if you'd like to hop in. I think I've got you.
Coming up. There we go. Hi, everyone. I guess everything that everybody said so far, I did see the whimsy from the beginning, but I also saw that darker nature. You're putting up premonition right now, and if that doesn't have a slightly darker nature, I don't know what would in your groupings. I was kind of fascinated. Is it Confusion? Is that what it's called? The one? It's just the one, I think the feet are like almost cemented into the ground. And it was so interesting to me because he looks a little scared. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm kind of fascinated. I did this one, yes. I really like that one a lot. I thought it was an interesting choice with the feet. It's almost holding him back. Instead of just him not moving forward himself, but it's holding him. I thought that was really interesting. But I did want to ask, what materials are you using? I didn't get to jump in until a little bit late, so that might have been discussed. I'm sorry.
I came into a really nice stash of marble recently. So I've been using marble as my base. It has nice weight. I can carve it. I can grind it, and I can paint it. This particular piece has a marble base. It's about 2.5 inches thick, and you can't tell from this lighting, but the base is painted to look like water. And
oh, okay.
This is my watercolor history coming in. I love to paint water and the transparency of water, where you see the riverbed beneath it. So this one's actually wading through water.
Oh, that's even more interesting then.
The other materials are fairly sophisticated wire armature, paper mache, over which I layer a polymer with some thickeners, which give it a very clay-like consistency, and then acrylic paint over that.
Well, then just following up on what you guys were just talking about, I do think you could probably go higher in your pricing. Earlier on, I was making an assumption of what you were making these out of. And with what you're saying, yeah, I think you probably could certainly go a little bit higher on your pricing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as you go on, Chaz, and as you kind of start to get collectors, and I would fully, kind of exploring this idea of marketability. Certainly, your work has a very distinctive and is only going to appeal to a certain set. It's not going to have a universal appeal. But as we've discussed in the past, that's not a bad thing. Finding an audience, a niche audience, that's more narrow can engender a more passionate collector base. And we have found that it tends to be the work in our gallery that is polarizing, shall we say, or somewhat divisive, that people either respond to very strongly in the negative or the affirmative, that will tend to sell the most regularly and rapidly. That you, as I say, you'll find that collector base that just feels more passionate about it. It stirs up that kind of passion. And we've looked at a variety of different work in these sessions, from the more extreme and different to kind of what I would consider more traditional conservative. And there's audience for all of that work. And I would suspect that some galleries would have a completely opposite experience, where they kind of lean more towards the traditional. But I would anticipate that, Chaz, you could not only find a great collector base, but I would suspect that with some legwork, you could find galleries that would be the perfect venue for showing this work, and that would be very excited about showing it to their collector base. And that would then lead to sales and an increase in the value of the work. I wonder too, Chaz, have you considered, I would think, here you are creating these pieces, and they're going to be one of a kind, right? Because you're hand building every element of it. Have you considered at some point potentially taking some of them into bronze and casting the pieces in additions and creating multiples, or have you had any thought process down that vein?
Until about a month ago, I had been working part-time with Marty Eichinger, who is a National Sculpture Society sculptor. He works in clay and casts everything in bronze. So I learned quite a bit about what's involved in that. His advice was, unless you have at least 4 sales, you can't break even, which means you really need a good distribution network before you venture into that. I have explored it. I haven't really embraced it yet. I haven't ruled it out either.
Yeah. And I think that is good advice. Certainly there is a lot of capital involved in creating molds and casting work in a foundry. But again, looking at some of the imagery that is so iconic, it would seem like you might find that some of that imagery would resonate in a way that it would almost be a shame to just be able to have only one collector enjoy that imagery. And so certainly I would encourage you to at least have that idea floating around. And as you start to get sales going and see which imagery gets the responses, to start thinking in terms of being able to do that. Because obviously with sculpture, where it is so labor intensive, as you get going, you run into some limits in terms of how much time you have available to create the pieces, that you'd want to be able to capitalize on some of the work that's gone into creating the vision for those pieces by being able to sell multiples of it. So certainly something to keep in mind. And there would be, with your work, there would be some technical aspects to think through. I wouldn't think that a traditional bronze patina would be what you would want on the work. So there would need to be some thought process into surfaces and colors and those kinds of things, but certainly would be worth exploring.
Jason, I have a question for you.
Sure.
I mean, you carry a number of bronze artists in your galleries. I have heard from several gallerists that the bronze market was really hot in the 80s and 90s, and people thought that all of those would appreciate. But since there are now a lot of things available on eBay or Craigslist for considerably less than they paid for them, that 1 or 2 gallerists have told me that they thought one-offs actually were a better investment in the long run because they would continue to appreciate.
That's a very interesting question. And I think that there are so many variables at play. You're right. There was from the really the late 70s clear through to the mid 90s. I kind of started in the business in the early 90s, and bronze was really still peaking at that point. And I'm not sure that it's so much a question of collectors seeing that there is other work out there on other platforms like an eBay or something like that, or that you can import from China as to what has come into play. I think that even bigger than that, from my observation, was the fact that starting in the mid 90s and going into the early 2000s, there were dramatic increases in the costs of producing bronze. One of them being the skyrocketing cost of copper and bronze alloys. And so suddenly in the 80s and 90s, artists were able to create these bronzes at a relative value compared to what they are now. And so it kind of fueled this frenzy. And then also, I just wonder if the market became a little bit saturated at that point. Everyone was buying a lot of bronze, and eventually you run out of display space for bronze. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see kind of cycle through, and we're at a little bit of a lull in the bronze market right now, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that come back up in the in the next 10 years or so, or sometime even between now and then. And there's still, I work with some sculptors, as you say, who are working in bronze, who are still very successful, and building, continued following for their work. Including I've worked with some artists who I would say are casting bronze work, not similar in style to yours, but similar in sensibility. And have done very well with their work over the years. So there's always a market. It's just kind of finding the right way to get to it. Let's go to a few more. I've got a few more hands up here. Let's see if I can get Lyle in. Lyle, do I have you here? Good morning, Lyle. Oh, maybe not. Lyle, I may not be able to get your audio in. Looks like I can't. I've got username CMLAU. Can I get you in? It looks like I'm having trouble getting anyone in. So let's go. Oh, there we go. Gotcha.
Hi. Hi.
Yes. Did you have a comment?
I did. I'm very impressed, first of all, with the colors choices of the sculptures. They are just so powerful, and they speak beautifully to me. My favorite is Premonition. And when you put Premonition up for the second time, I saw the figure in the legs, which just blew me away. That was beautiful. Beautiful. Can you hear me? Can you still?
Yep. Gotcha.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would suspect that as people are looking at your work, if you had a group of 5 different people, you might get 5 different favorite pieces among those people. That people are going to respond to them in very unique ways and have different resonance with different people.
And I had a question too, if you don't mind, Jason.
Sure, absolutely.
The artist. I'm curious as how you start. I'm an oil painter, so I'm just blown away by people who do the sculptures. Do you start with the base, or because your bases are all different and all seem to have a connection? Do you start with the base idea and build from there, or where do you actually begin?
I have on my drawing table right now probably 50 or 60 sketchbooks, mostly 4x6, which I keep in my pocket, in my glove box, on my nightstand. I'm sketching constantly.
Okay.
Once a figure starts to speak to me, then I usually transfer it to scale, to tracing paper. I will modify that several times through several different layers of tracing paper. And that becomes my pattern for my first piece of wire, which is the beginning of the armature. I'll mount that on a piece of particle board or something as a working base until I get it to a point where it needs to be anchored to something more permanent. I tend to not mount them on marble until late in the process because I don't want to splatter polymer or other things all over it. I don't want to make more cleanup than necessary. I've been able, my first pieces 4 or 5 years ago were taking 40, 50 hours to do. I'm down to 15 to 20 now for even some fairly sophisticated pieces.
Wow. They're beautiful. I wouldn't change a thing. I think they're stunning, and the colors are amazing. I'm really impressed. Beautiful, beautiful work.
It was my background in advertising. I have always been very concept driven. I tend to play with sketches until I see concept emerge. And my process, my actual years as a creative director, pushing other people to think further and take an idea further. Now I have to turn that back on myself. But
Oh, I
my
love that.
process is generally, what haven't I done before? Why not?
I love that. It's very good.
What else can I do? A fellow who used to work for me used to joke around. He said, "I'm going to carve 'what if' on your tombstone."
That's good.
I replied, "So what if I'm cremated?"
Yeah. Love it.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
awesome.
you so much.
Thank you. And let's go then to some of the comments and feedback. Some of these aren't going to need any response, but Alicia from Mesa, Arizona, my neighbor here, says very imaginative and colorful. They do seem to express their titles. So I think that's a really interesting point. Chaz, talk about the titles. At what point in your process does the title come along? Is it there in the beginning, or is it suggested as you're creating the piece?
There's usually a working title, a theme, a single word or two words that emerges during the sketching process. Piece I'm working on currently, I have a sketchbook page with about 5 different titles on it now, and I haven't decided which one is appropriate yet, and maybe none of them by the time I'm finished. Again, this is something I learned in advertising. The visual makes one statement, the headline makes another. And there's something cognitive that happens. I aim for that, where I want the title to suggest something, but not nail it down. And again, like the premonition piece, you don't necessarily see the second figure in your first viewing. So I want people to process that. What I find interesting is 5 people looking at the same piece don't see the same thing. They all come away with something different. But the goal, I think, in exploring an image, I want to explore it until I find what's the primal archetype behind that image. What is the primal gesture that expresses the concept? When I get to that, I believe I've actually transcended race, gender, culture, and we all tend to label ourselves, brand ourselves certain ways. I think that's not necessarily a community spirit.
Yeah, and something that there's value in questioning that.
If you get to some primal quality, then I think there's room where we all relate, we are all connected. That's kind of where I would like to be with every
Yeah.
piece.
Well, and so last week, you'll remember we're looking at abstract work, and we talked a little bit about titles. I think this is another great illustration of the power of titles, and I love what you've said about it, Chaz. We want something that's evocative and that invites someone to think and see things differently. And I would suspect that with your work, I've seen this with other artists that I've worked with, that people are drawn close by the work, and enjoy exploring it visually. And then that title can really have the power to just make it click. And that there would be a response to the title and the piece that would make people say, I've got to have this piece, that it just really resonates at a deeper level. So definitely, I know that, and especially as you go along and you go from having created 50 pieces or 60 to 100 or 300 pieces, suddenly those titles become a lot more work. But boy, it's sure worth that effort and finding just the right title for the right piece. They deserve it. This from Stephen. Stephen, I think do I have you in the session? I think rather than reading yours, I might just have you hop in, and yep, I see you there. Good morning, Stephen. If you can unmute yourself and just share your comment.
Good morning. Maybe we should just read it, because I know I can go on and on and on.
Sure. So you said, and I quote, it's this intense, primordial, far earlier than ancient energy that drives the image as well as the creative force. What I mean is that this unbridled art expression, splashing and slashing media about feels like a naturally occurring expression. And I think we've kind of already spoken a little bit to that. in terms of your process and creating these pieces. Any reaction to that kind of that primordial effect beyond what we've already maybe said?
I think he's captured.
Well said. Nothing else
what I'm
needs to be
thinking
said.
about. Yeah.
I do, though.
Okay, go for it.
The thing is that it has to do with the medium. And it's one thing that I had learned in design school was that the medium always exerts its influence. And it's amazing now that I know that it's paper mache, it's amazing to me how articulate that is in all of your work. You know, the slight deformity of the character that leads to the gesture. You don't get that. If it were in clay or anything else, that would be a whole different expression. But here, it's absolutely right. And so you've got something going that is a very thin line, but it's wonderful.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And this comment from T. Monroe in Los Alamos, California. The work is very creative and expressive. I'd like to understand the inspiration behind the work, and hopefully we've already kind of answered that. My question would be, do you align your work with that which pertains to the dark side, such as satanic cult practices? Okay, so that's pretty specific. The work seems to carry a lot of symbolic hidden messages. That's probably an extreme expression, but certainly one would think that some of those undercurrents, from ancient cultures that have come into modern thought would have some play there.
I've enjoyed reading Joseph Campbell, and I think about the time I started doing sculpture, I was explaining to another artist that I felt it was time to go more internal with my symbols and my imagery. This is when I was moving away from painting landscape, and I felt the need to do something more personal. And at that time, I specifically said, I think I'm going to follow my own hero's journey. Part of that is dealing with, at some point, something dark. I'm Italian. I have a sense of humor. I can't help it. I make jokes out of everything. That's what my family does. I don't really identify with dark or satanic or negative anything, which isn't to say it doesn't exist and it shouldn't be acknowledged. I just don't choose to dwell on it much.
Yeah, excellent. Eileen says, have you or would you consider doing works larger? If larger to build in relief, so it's easier to place in a room, or do larger 3D figure space providing. So would these works work at a larger scale from a technical standpoint?
I have a proposal out right now to do a four figures holding a hoop above their heads. It's a very community, a community symbol. I've proposed this for a community here in Oregon at 7.5 feet tall on a 3.5 foot pedestal. I have a couple of welders and a couple of people who can do wire mesh and basically ferro cement process, which I've never done before. It's a pretty hefty budget. I don't know, since I've submitted that proposal, whether that funding has gone away in favor of supporting some more critical initiatives or not. But yes, I have. In fact, the sculptor Marty Eichinger that I used to work with from day one, our very first meeting, had challenged me that these should be life size or bigger. So that's always in the back of my mind. It's an issue in my studio because I'm somewhat limited.
And something that obviously you could be working up to. Okay, Roseanne asks a great question. I'd like to see artist statements for each piece. I can't tell if that's included in the presentation, but I enjoy knowing what's behind each sculpture. And this is part of an earlier comment. She says, I'd like to see how some of them would show in other color combinations, perhaps darker or more subdued. The boldness of the colors is attractive, and I think it works, but I'd like to see some other options presented. And so kind of two different questions there. One, do you develop an artwork statement with some of the pieces? In other words, is there more of a narrative there, or do you kind of, you already mentioned you kind of like to let the viewer bring some of that story?
I'm always torn on that topic. I have an instructor from Pratt who I still am in touch with, who is constantly hammering me to write the story, write the story. And I have written several, usually just a paragraph or two.
Yeah.
And it is an intention to put that into a blurb book or something. But I also don't want to cloud the perception by a viewer with my version of it, because I see each of these. In fact, a show I had several years ago, the theme of the show was mirrors. And the talk that I did there was really how each of these mirrors a projection that you put on. And if I go out of my way to tell you the story behind it before you share yours, I've obliterated your perception of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It would be, I would say that this might be an area that some experimentation could be done, as you begin showing them, and galleries would be the perfect proving ground for this, to develop some statements or stories with some of the pieces, see what the response is, and if it works, maybe you explore doing more of them. Maybe you don't have to do them for all of the pieces, but maybe some of the work merits a little bit more of a story. That, as we said, the title already kind of begins a narrative. And so it'd just be interesting to see how adding more narrative to that plays with viewers. And again, it could add another dimension there. Laura says, it's so original and fresh. Your stylizing of the figures and use of animal type parts totally engages me. Monica says, I love the work, the way you present the work, both in how you isolate the pieces with color backgrounds and also how you shot it within the world of art collectibles, and also wall art behind another to show some expanded breadth of work. Keep it up and hope you never find yourself pigeonholed by your patrons. Keep pushing the limits of your expression. So that's a kind of an interesting point. Your work is so unique and different. You wouldn't think that would be an issue, but as time goes on and you're creating the work, the question becomes, okay, how consistent it becomes constraining. And do you have any concerns about that with your work in terms of feeling like you become kind of dialed into one kind of specific direction and lose some of the flexibility to work outside that?
I feel like there's still a fair amount of breadth in the style. I have a number of pieces that have gone more figurative. And I don't really want to go that direction. I would rather stay more in the abstracted form. I have themes that go both ways. Part of the process of determining how to bring a piece into reality is, how does it fit into the family? And again, I mean, I literally consider these like characters in a movie, so, what role does this one play, and how far can I go afield before it looks like someone else's work?
Yeah.
I don't.
And how big is the cast of that movie that you're creating?
It's getting larger by the day.
And do some of those characters get repeat appearances?
The premonition figure with the ghosted figure between the legs, I have done several versions of that concept. If they were all side by side, you would recognize it, but looking at them on different walls, you wouldn't catch it immediately.
Awesome.
I mean, I really challenge myself with every piece. I mean, what can I do that I haven't done before? But again, how far can I stretch it? It's like a jazz musician. How far can I stretch it without losing the melody?
Yeah. Well, Chaz, we've done it. We've run right out of time, but I wanted to take a moment and thank you. It's fun to bring these artists in, and I know it could be a little bit of a nerve-wracking experience. I want to thank you for sharing your work with us and taking the feedback with it. I've encouraged all of our art featured artists so far, and I would make the same encouragement to you. this work deserves a broader audience. And I would encourage you to get out and show it to some galleries and continue participating in shows. Obviously, we're in a little bit of a funky time right now to be doing that. But as we get out of that time, certainly your idea of approaching galleries in the Southwest makes a lot of sense to me. And New Mexico, Arizona, Sedona would be another market that I would think of. And so I would encourage you to be pursuing that and to keep creating the awesome, unique work that you're doing.
Jason, thanks for this opportunity to be on this critique. I appreciate your input and all the reactions from everyone else who participated. So thank all of you.
And do you have a website?
Chas, C-H-A-S, Martin.com.
Excellent. We'd encourage everybody to hop over there and you can see additional examples of the work. Thanks for joining us, everyone. If you haven't, be sure and hop over to red.blog and join our email list so you get notices of these upcoming critique sessions. I know I've been getting a lot of requests saying, hey, how do I show my work or have my work reviewed or considered to be in a critique? That signing up for our email list will put you into the queue to have an opportunity to do that. It's going to take a while for us to get to everybody who wants to do it, but signing up for the mailing list is the best way to do it. Again, thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll look forward to seeing you in our next session. Take care.